Okay,
I
let's start
do.
IBM.
Just because we were getting all nostalgic in the pre-production here today, Frank. We were looking at IBM's history and when they started making typewriters and when they became a company. This stock has a very, very
It's an old
interesting long
company.
history for
An
sure. Yeah.
old company. You know, and I don't think we realize that about some of these companies, right? This was a type they sold typewriters in the 30s. Like
Mhm.
that was one of their biggest contracts they ever got that really established IBM was from the government. But they were even a company well before that. I
Mhm.
mean, Greg, how long have they been paying a dividend?
1916 is the data I have. Was the
1916,
first
like
dividend they paid.
1916. Think about that, guys. But so it's a very very old company here in IBM. But IBM comes out today and they did fairly decent from the raw numbers perspective. And when you look at their raw numbers versus what's happening on the gap, you kind of got a little bit of a similar thing with what happened last quarter as well with IBM reported fairly decent numbers, but there's one big concern that the market has about IBM, and it's this spinning off all their managed infrastructure services, businesses to Samsung, to Taiwan Semiconductor, and focusing on developing a lot of that in house, and they're going to be doing that through 2023. And here's the problem. Nobody trusts IBM. Well, that's Intel, but nobody trusts these types of moves in IBM or Intel right now. And so even though IBM posted fairly decent numbers, raw numbers, I mean, think about IBM's numbers very quickly, $2.07 versus the 178 on expectation. That's
Mhm.
a good beat for IBM. That is a legitimate beat for IBM, a nice little 10% beat there. Revenue came in right in line at 20.4 billion versus 20.5 billion. And even though IBM has certainly fallen out of favor with the market over the last 10 years, really kind of having its Microsoft decade. Same thing with Intel. Even though that's fallen out of favor, these numbers are still fairly decent overall numbers. Again, we're talking about a company that generated $20 billion in revenue in the last quarter. We're talking about a company that did beat EPS projections at 20.7 versus the $1.78. They did decrease revenue year over year again. This is very similar storyline with Intel, 4 consecutive quarters here. And so you do have some struggles, but the biggest struggle that IBM is having is they're simply trying to focus on cloud and AI, and they're trying to remove some of their infrastructure business that really made IBM Big Blue. And over the last 6 months, they're trying to shed that Big Blue to focus on cloud-based businesses, to focus on artificial intelligence, and the market just simply isn't buying into that yet. Now they're also not saying aggressively this is not going to work, and they're not saying this is a nothing burger, and they're just not buying into it yet. And they're giving IBM a little bit of time to kind of work those things out as they're making this transition from that big blue of everything that came around the infrastructure components of IBM to focus more on cloud-based businesses to focus more on infrastructure from an artificial intelligence perspective. And that's just a little bit of a takes time to kind of redesign those things. Microsoft had this moment in the 2000s where Microsoft was trying to find who they were, and when they started focusing on cloud-based businesses, kind of what IBM is trying to do, and they're not similar companies, but they're trying to go through similar things. Looking at this on a longer term chart, looking at the 2000s here on Microsoft, you see a lot of just neutrality here on Microsoft throughout the entire 2000s. Microsoft never recovered from those highs of the 1990s. Those highs were all the way up here at 60. You see what happened throughout the entire decade of the 2000s. Here's the subprime market crash. And so from the 2000s, Microsoft didn't really do anything. After 2008, Microsoft tried to reinvent the wheel. IBM's trying to reinvent the wheel. Intel's trying to reinvent the wheel. Can they be successful in that, similar to what Microsoft did? Because guys, we talk about Microsoft today as one of those top 3 companies in the marketplace, and rightly so. But 10 years ago, that wasn't Microsoft. 10 years ago, Microsoft was struggling in the same capacity that Intel's struggling and IBM are struggling here today. So can IBM recreate that will to where, and really, it was Jim Cramer putting Microsoft in. You got to give Cramer some credit here. Cramer identified what was happening in Microsoft, and Cramer correctly put those into the FANG stocks there in that 13-14 era. And you see what happened to Microsoft once it did catch the favor of the month there in the stock market. Can IBM and Intel have that type of decade? I think is an open question. I have my doubts. But in terms of what IBM is doing, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to rub off the rust from the last decade. They're trying to reinvent the wheel a little bit, similar to what IBM has done in its past, and that it's simply going to be a little choppy waters as they do that. But that's what's happening from the raw numbers, Tim.